When is solar energy green enough? That is a major question that the industry is facing today. It's not enough just to create this clean energy environment, but how do we create other co-benefits with these at the same time? This is something that's being asked by agencies, by policymakers, by communities, and sometimes even developers themselves. One of the areas where this regularly comes up as a topic is around pollinator conservation. Pollinator conservation is a big topic, and when we look at building these sites, this is a big consideration. Interestingly, bumblebees are fascinating creatures. In the UK, there was some recent research that showed that bumblebees actually have the capacity to learn, to problem solve, and then to teach other bumblebees within their hive to expedite their learning curve to forage more efficiently. And so you can think about it that bumblebees are sort of like some of the world's smallest innovators. So this is where it typically starts. When we think about utility scale solar, right, large scale solar, it starts in places like this, agricultural fields like this soybean field, across much of the non-arid US. And so as we're designing what the layout's gonna be, what the infrastructure that's gonna be put in place there will be, there's considerations for vegetation as well. In these parts of the country, there's gonna be vegetation there, right? It's gonna grow on its own, much like your garden. If you don't plant something, you're gonna get weeds. And so for solar facilities, they want to plant something that's going to be compatible with those operations, that will support the power production and the long-term maintenance of that site. So that question from a vegetation standpoint becomes, what can you do with this? What can you do with this field? These hundreds of hectares typically in that type of environment. But then we often ask other questions. Well, how can you support things like pollinator conservation? How can you improve soil health? How can we reduce pesticide use? How can we create vegetation that might be more resilient in a changing climate? And so that simple question all of a sudden becomes very, very complex. Utility scale solar as an industry is booming. Just over 10 years ago, this was just getting off the ground. It was in its infancy. Sure, there's rooftop solar, there's commercial solar, but utility scale, where we're replacing large generation facilities with hectares of solar fields, was just developing. So here we are today. If we look ahead another 5 years, that industry is going to double in growth again, just in the US. And if we were to extend this graph beyond this, we would see it double even yet again beyond that in the next few years. At the same time, we're losing our biodiversity rapidly. Over the past, I say hours intentionally, our biodiversity can be a vague, nebulous concept a lot of times to people, but when you think about it, it's the species, it's the habitats that underpin all the ecosystem services that we rely upon for our food supply, for food security, for pest and disease resistance, for medicine innovations, and for inspiration for technology. That all comes from a grounding in biodiversity. And what we have here is something they call the Living Planet Index. What this does is this aggregates the population trends of over 20,000 species globally since 1970 when they started tracking this. And on average, species are declining at roughly 68% globally. This is just for vertebrate species. It doesn't even include things like the skipper that's shown here or the bumblebee we discussed earlier. By some estimates, things like bumblebees have declined 80–90% in the past 20 to 30 years. So when you think about solar, it's where the vision of that clean energy future and the need to address things like the biodiversity crisis really converge. And the scale of utility scale solar is massive. In the US alone, to reach the clean energy targets for the next 10 years, it's going to require roughly 14 million hectares of land. So 14,000 square kilometers of land, roughly equivalent to the size of the state of Connecticut. Or if you're in Europe, that's roughly the same size as the country of Montenegro. In Canada, you take Banff National Park, double it in size, and then you still need land to achieve that same size. So the scale is just sheerly massive. So we come back to that question, when is solar energy green enough? How do we address those environmental concerns that communities have, that we have as a global society, while also creating that green energy future? What we find often, because we all want this green energy future now, is that this is what we get. We get grass-dominated vegetation within arrays. It's something that we can mow quickly, or we can build these arrays quickly. We can minimize construction costs. We can reduce risks. And what happens as humans, right, when we're faced with complex problems, often with a lot of urgency, we kind of stick to our familiarity bias with what we know, with what we're familiar with. And a lot of times that means grass. But that also means we're committed then to mowing for the next 30 years at potentially thousands of acres. And so, again, we're being challenged to think about this. Like we've heard throughout this Innovation Summit, we're asking more of our design. We're asking more of our development. And solar is no exception. It's facing those same questions. How can we do things like increase pollinator habitat? How can we do things like improve soil health or carbon sequestration? How can we build vegetation systems that are more resilient to that changing climate? And in some cases, the developers or the eventual owners of these sites are also looking at these systems to help improve biodiversity to contribute to their own ESG reporting. So as we're asking more and more, it requires more diverse vegetation. So in simple, how do we go from left to right in this image where we have grass-dominated systems that we're mowing to more diverse vegetation to provide those services? This is where our work comes into focus. We are part of a team that's involved with this pollinator habitat aligned with solar energy, or what we call our PHASE project. This is a project that's funded through the US Department of Energy. It's being spearheaded by the University of Illinois Chicago, and is supported by a research team from the National Renewable Energy Lab, Argonne National Lab, as well as the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign. And some of their field research is going to inform tool development that we're supporting. Some of that field research includes things like you see here, which is pan traps deployed out within solar arrays in different types of vegetation that's established on sites to see what kinds of pollinators, what kinds of insects are using different vegetation on site, so we can see how the ecological effects of that look. We're also installing devices like this under the underside of these bifacial panels to measure the albedo or the reflectance off of vegetation and different vegetation types to see if different vegetation types can actually influence the power production at some of these facilities as well. So we're looking at performance, ecological, and then financial impacts of vegetation. So with this team, we're bringing together this knowledge, this experience to answer these questions that the industry has. But we can't do it alone. We have to involve the industry. So we have a number of developers from throughout the industry involved in the project, weighing in on what we're doing, making sure we're focused on the right questions and providing the resources that they need. It's also supplemented by a technical advisory team, practitioners, agencies, advocates, academics, researchers that are asking similar questions or working in similar spaces to share, again, that knowledge so we can provide those tools and the information that the industry needs to solve those problems. At Stantec, our involvement is with the developing tools to inform decision-making as people go through that process of considering vegetation for pollinators on solar. We have a series of 4 tools that act in concert together, starting with an implementation manual. It's focused on, is pollinator vegetation appropriate for their site? And if it is, how can they deploy it effectively given the designs that they have in place? Once they do that, we have a cost comparison calculator where we can compare different vegetation regimes as well as certain aspects of designs to get a comparison of how they would affect both the upfront capital expenditure costs, but then also the long-term operational maintenance costs of that site. Beyond that, we have the seed selection tool that is focused on how do you pick particular species to fit the constraints, the design constraints of the site, as well as some of those other objectives like for soil health, for pollinator health, and then create a species list that you can share with vendors, with nurseries to get the supply that they need for these thousands of acres that they're deploying on the ground. And then once it's established, we have a habitat assessment module. So did it actually all result in the outcomes that they were expecting on the ground? And then how does that change over time? And so these 4 tools can be used together at facilities throughout North America as they're deploying these on new solar. And so, again, it's like those bumblebees that we talked about at the onset, right? We're learning, we're collaborating, we're sharing to improve the knowledge and the implementation of everybody working on this. When you look at, this is what it can look like on the ground, right? This is an actual Stantec project located in the state of Indiana in the US, where we actually have some of that compatible, diverse vegetation that's benefiting pollinators. It's working with a solar facility. And this is what we hope to create more throughout on the landscape through the participation and the collaboration on this effort. And so going back to that question, when is solar energy green enough? It's when we build solar, when we build that clean energy with biodiversity working together. Thank you.